Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Rain Network's live for our Friday today. Here, I'm Ryan Bold, one of the senior Middle East North Africa analysts here at Rain Network. I'm here with Matt Orr, our Eurasia analyst, and he obviously focuses a great deal on Russia. And today we were going to be talking about Russo-Turkish relations, and we have a specific event that we can point to. Yesterday, Vladimir Putin and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan did an online meeting, a little bit like we're doing right now, to inaugurate the first nuclear power plant in Turkey, which was built by a Russian company, Rostom. And this is an interesting moment because it is a Russian company deep inside of NATO building a nuclear power plant while the Russians are invading Ukraine and the Turks are implicitly backing the Ukrainians, but at the same time trying to work with the Russians. And so it's a very complicated relationship with a lot of angles going into it. Matt, how would you characterize this relationship?
Yeah. Oh man, it's a complex one, but I think right what maybe sometimes gets missed or undercovered is just how I mean, there's Russian domestic politics gets kind of cursory coverage a lot of the time, and I don't think it necessarily gets all the way understood. The way that Putin and his attempt to really deepen the relationship with Erdogan in Turkey, it's something that certain kind of somewhat esoteric far right figures in Russia have pushed for a long time. Most notably, Alexander Dugin, whose daughter was killed several months ago. But on other elements of the Russian right, and even within Putin's kind of power base, the relationship with Erdogan, Turkey, and specifically the construction of this nuclear power plant is very controversial because for them, it's why is Russia, providing such an incredible piece of infrastructure to help this country that has been Russia's biggest enemy for centuries, and as a country that is continuing to this day to see its sphere of influence, this neo Ottoman idea, as coming into the South Caucasus and Central Asia and our former backyard. So that's a real kind of sticking point. And so even this nuclear power plant, the terms they feel are way too favorable to Turkey, the way that it's being financed. And right, I think that it's such an interesting microcosm of the general kind of complexity of this relationship. I guess my question for you about it is, I mean, how do Erdogan and the Turks really think about it and justify it, particularly at this time where right now they also know that the Russians are obstructing a lot of their ambitions.
Right. And so, when you look at it from the Turkish angle, you were kind of referring to those ambitions in the Caucasus and Central Asia, and of course in Syria, where the Russian and Turkish troops have come to blows at various points during that country's civil war. The Turkish view of this is that Russia is a partner that they can use. It is not a partner that they want to rely on completely, but they want to keep relations going with the Russians in very specific places. They compartmentalize their relationship, whereas in the old days when the Russian Empire and the Ottomans went to war, everything fell apart and they were at each other's throats for however long that lasted. Now it's a more sophisticated version of statecraft where the Russians and the Turks are able to shoot at each other in Syria while coordinating economically for things like energy. Well, at the same time, the Russians are selling them advanced air systems like the S-400, which the Turks conceivably are you thinking about using on Russian warplanes. All of these contradictory behaviors make sense in part because they're both Russia to a certain extent is still a great power, but it in some ways it behaves like a middle power. Its constraints are so strong on it. And the same with Turkey. Middle powers basically can't choose to do everything. They have to make choices about how they can exploit geopolitical behavior of other states. And that's pretty much what Turkey is classically doing. It has its big idea of the world, but it can't act on all of it.
So do you basically see it more as kind of Erdogan and Putin lock? I mean, this is the way I see it, and and then you can maybe respond to this. I see it as it's kind of a scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of deal, where every favor can be offered and then but it must be returned, and there's really this kind of constant negotiation where they will do things for each other, but in the places where their interests collide, right, then it can breaks down. I guess my question is, I mean, is that really the extent of it, or is there some sort of broader ideological affinity, for lack of a better word, where, hey, we're standing up to the West, we're not part of the Western order. We don't want to see Russia get embarrassed in Ukraine because that could set a precedent towards Turkey's own conduct, etc. I mean, is there anything like that going on here as well?
I think there is. And I think the way to frame the ideological alignment is that they both want to see the multipolar world, and they want to see the multipolar world get bigger. Both of them have interests that will not be addressed by the West, and are even blocked by the West. And so that's why they turn to each other in those moments where there's things like the Americans were not going to build a nuclear power plant in Turkey. The Chinese probably weren't that interested, but the Russians were, and they were willing to do it for a certain price. And so that's why the Rostom ended up building that nuclear power plant there. And that's kind of this implicit idea that in the multipolar world, Russia should be allowed to build its nuclear power plants wherever it wants, and Turkey should be allowed to get its nuclear supplies from whomever it wants. And that's really a big driver of what their alignments are. At the same time, it creates a mess. The multipolar world also means that they have competition in Armenia and Azerbaijan, where they're backing opposing sides, and of course in Ukraine, where Turkey's backing the Ukrainians militarily. So it creates a real mess. I think one of the more notable things that we think about from an everyday standpoint is that a lot of people view this relationship as like Turkey shouldn't be in NATO. It's not really in the West. It needs to pick a side, etc. Particularly when it comes to sanctions and doing business through Turkey. What have you seen so far? Like, what's the Russian strategy with using Turkey as a way to evade sanctions?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah. Right. That's a whole interesting topic. What I want to say in response to what you just said, though, is that, I mean, for me, if I were the Turks, you could very easily kind of trump up your belief in these ideological aspects while you go around fleecing the Russians and get them to build huge nuclear reactors that are very useful to you on very favorable terms. And that's kind of the worry from the Russian side, is they're not sure about whether Erdogan or another Turkish leader, because as we're going to talk about in a second, there's not, right, Erdogan doesn't speak for all of Turkey per se, and so there's some dangers there. As far as the sanctions evasion angle, right, I mean, I think it's definitely fascinating, and it's another sign to the Russians of the limitations of the investment in this idea of Turkey, on ideological grounds can be aligned with us, because right when rubber meets the road, and Turkey's economic relationships with the West become under threat, and we have these U.S. officials making constant trips to Turkey, Treasury officials of various ranks, all kinds of different U.S. government organizations, and it's clear when those come down. Now we're starting to see where these Turkish transit companies, exporters, etc., are saying, well, we don't want to put ourselves at risk. There are certain risks to the export of sanctioned products to Russia, and using our country as this transit hub for sanctions good activities, etc. So yeah, there are these limitations. What I definitely want to get to is this Turkish election, because if you have, the Russians feel like Erdogan has kind of been their guy for a long time, and now all of a sudden with this health scare and everything else, in just a matter of weeks, it seems like things are changing. Do you think that this Russian-Turkish relationship is really durable, and how could we see it change under a potential different leader of Turkey?
And it's kind of the $1 million question. On a certain level, we can make the safe assumption that state interest or state interest, national interests don't shift from leader to leader. So the next president of Turkey, whoever that inevitably will be, will still view Russia through this kind of transactional multipolar lens. At the same time, Putin and Erdogan have they have a hotline to each other. They have years of diplomacy behind them in places like Syria and places like Greece, where the Russians have tried to play a more useful role. That will be disrupted, and it will mean that the next Turkish government will have a chance to align itself a bit closer to the West, and they won't necessarily have the political acumen to be able to deflect criticism from Turkish nationalists and from Russian nationalists as well, that they're not drifting away from Russia. That's going to be trickier to do from a narrative perspective, from a political perspective. But I don't expect that for example, we wouldn't see Turkey sending troops into Ukraine. We wouldn't see them substantially alter their Caucasus strategies, but we will see the tone change, and we could see a reaction from the Russians saying that we need you to be more like Erdogan, and they'll be looking for pressure points to remind a potential new Turkish government that they need to return to those old patterns, even if it's just rhetorical.
Yeah. And on the other side, if Erdogan remains president, gets reelected, and the everything blows over, do we see him, in response to this idea, almost kind of doubling down on the Russia relationship, maybe reassessing his trajectory towards the West, reassessing, military hardware support for Ukraine, which they are sending in quite significant amounts, things like that?
Right. This is where the constraints of the middle power kick in again. If there is a ceasefire or freeze of fighting in Ukraine, that will afford more freedom for Turkey, just as it will with the Europeans. We've talked about this. The Europeans would be very tempted to ease energy sanctions on the Russians in the event of an actual ceasefire in Ukraine. At the same time, the Turks would follow that lead, and the Turks would try to deepen their relationship. So it really depends on events in Ukraine, and if it evolves into a frozen conflict versus a ceasefire versus and even a peace treaty. Those are all geopolitical events that would be big enough that would allow Turkey to change its strategy in the wake of them. But I don't think it'll be able to do very much preceding them. It really needs to watch and see how the battlefield develops in eastern Ukraine.
Yeah, well, gosh, I mean, so much fascinating stuff to go in here. I mean, I think in terms of the main implications, of the Russia Turkey relationship for businesses, that these waters are going to be very muddy and unclear, no matter who wins this election, and so that's why you need to stay with us and stay with Rain. Go to rainnetwork.com, where you can read more of Ryan and I's analysis. Thank you so much, Ryan, for being here. And thank you to all our listeners for joining us. We will see you next week.
See you guys later.